for joining us today. I know that this is an exceptionally complicated time. March is always a challenging month at the end of school year, but especially in the context of managing COVID within and beyond post-secondary institutions. We recognize that this is a difficult time for people. That said, we know that this topic is especially important, and we felt it was critical to provide mentorship from tenured BIPOC scholars for those scholars who may be on or working towards the pathway to tenure. So the Canadian Sociological Association wishes to situate its presence as an uninvited guest on the traditional territories of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples across what has come to be known through a colonial project as Canada. This acknowledgement is to recognize the enduring relationships that exist between Indigenous nations and their territories that the CSA and its constituents work and live on. As an organization, we strive to understand our role within Canada's ongoing settler colonial project that subjects Indigenous people to dispossession and genocide. We recognize our participation and complacency in colonial modalities and acknowledge knowledge systems, and are committed to decolonial praxis that centers and affirms the contributions of Indigenous elders and scholars to the field of sociology. I'm joining you today from the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Attawandaron, and Lenape people in what we now call London, Ontario. And I would just invite you to take a moment to recognize the lands that you are on, either as an ancestral steward of that land or as a settler. In a brief overview of the format today, we're going to begin with approximately 10 minutes of comments from each of the panelists, after which we'll have a discussion. The panelists' presentations and those first 15 minutes of discussion will be recorded. As you can see, we're recording right now, and they'll be posted to the CSA's YouTube account, which you can access through the CSA website. We recognize that some circumstances are sufficiently complex or delicate that participants may not want their questions recorded. So after that 15 minutes, we'll make it clear that we're stopping recording, and we'll provide a more private opportunity to ask questions. Even given that context, we know that some questions or concerns are simply not possible to ask in a public forum. And if that's the case, we ask you to reach out to the CSA and you can ask to have your email forwarded to one of the panel members if that would be helpful for you. In terms of logistics, the chat is visible only to the panelists and organizers. So if you have specific comments for a panelist, you can submit them that way. Please note that this is a monitored and not a private chat. Also, if you have any questions, you can post them through the question and answer tab at the bottom of the screen. And through that function, you can like any question that you see, and that will help us to know which questions most people are thinking about. So for some brief introductions, I'm Kristin Lozanski. I'm an associate professor and chair of the Department of Sociology at King's University College, which is an affiliate of Western University. And I've recently joined the Equity Committee of the CSA, and I'm very happy to be here today and to introduce our four panelists. So our first panelist to introduce is Xiaobei Chen. Xiaobei is a professor of sociology and associate chair in sociology and anthropology at Carleton University, and she's president of the Canadian Sociological Association. Her current research and community engagement focus on anti-Chinese and anti-Asian racism in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Next, we have Dr. Ina Dua, who is a professor in the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at York University. And Dr. Dua has published extensively on theorizing racism and anti-racism, particularly in Canadian universities, equity policies, and anti-racism policies. Dr. Irene Shankar is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Mount Royal University, and her main areas of interest include the sociology of gender, intersectional feminist theories, critical race theory, and the sociology of health and illness. Dr. Shankar is the chair of the CSA's Equity Committee. And finally, we have Dr. Cora Voyageur, who is a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Calgary. Dr. Voyageur has conducted extensive community-initiated research with many First Nations and Indigenous organizations and has been invited to present at conferences globally. Dr. Voyageur is a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation in Fort Chipewyan, Alberta. And so now we're going to begin with some presentations. And to start us off, I'd like to ask Dr. Voyageur if she could share some of her thoughts about navigating the tenure path for our participants today.
There we go. I was having trouble getting organized here. So good morning, everyone. I'm Cora Voyageur. I'm a sociologist at the University of Calgary. I'm going to quickly go through a short presentation that I did regarding how Indigenous professors experience the academy. So with regards to the Academy, as Indigenous professors, we're relatively new participants in the Academy, and in the social structure in Canada, as we know, Indigenous people occupy a relatively low rung in a stratified country. And as a result of this, we suffer quite a lot of racism and discrimination. We also, as First Nation people, work and live under very restrictive policies. The Indian Act, for example, and other policies, and some that are specifically for women. We have an oppressive history in Canada with examples of what some people call genocide. Other people bristle at this word. However, as Indigenous people, this is something that we believe has happened to us with regards to erasing our culture, and in fact with policies that would have erased us as a people. So what we find with the Indigenous community is that, you know, we are a very over researched population, and there's a transition going on between Indigenous people and those of us that are professors. There's a transition between research subject and colleague. So moving from someone who is now has a seat at the table and has some say in what is happening within the academy. So we know that there is privilege to Western knowledge over traditional knowledge, you know, as far as cultural capital goes, and as well as hegemony, you know, the domination that goes on with some forms of knowledge being privileged over others. So again, relatively new at the academy. Also, with regards to merit assignment, we know that we are many more women than males in the academy, which makes us different than mainstream, where there are more there's higher male representation than females. And within the Indigenous studies area, there were people who came into the area very early on and who became the granddaddies, and who really were not that welcoming to individuals that were coming in, that were making becoming the competition. So again, and as researchers and professors, we work in a very competitive environment. So with regards to Indigenous professors and First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, there are about 200 in Canada according to COUT. About 1.4% of the university professors are Indigenous, and 3% of college teachers. Of those, approximately 60% are First Nation, and very few Inuit. With regards to salaries, we make more, we make less than non-racialized men. And with regards to the comparison of males to males, a female makes about 53% of a non-racialized female in the academy, and males make about 57%. So when we look at the traditional values of the 7 grandfather teachings, you can see that the traditional values, traditional knowledge fits very well within the academic environment with regards to the Holy Trinity of research, teaching, and service, but also as colleagues, we also contribute. So strategies for the academy, we all must know that we have our own beliefs. skills, abilities. And one thing that I found quite difficult was traditionally we do not toot our own horn. And in the academy, unless we do that, we simply get overlooked only because there is, a very, people are very busy. And so anyway, this was something that I had to learn. So we have to stand up for ourselves and also jealously guard our time and know that it's okay to say no to committee work, because as people of color and Indigenous people, we find ourselves being placed on these committees because they want to have parity or representation from non-white individuals. And also publish as much as you can. And within the Indigenous community, we believe that, if we don't write it ourselves, someone else will, and the representation of us may not be accurate. So it's up to us to be sure that we publish. Find yourself a mentor. Also cite other Indigenous scholars. You have to get everybody's name out there in the discourse. Apply for grants, short and long-term projects, and save the hard questions until you are in a more secure position. We know that people that are in newly hired individuals are placed in a precarious situation with regards to tenure and promotion. And also, student evaluations are very important as well. And also, do not move into administration too quickly. Many times we find people who are newly minted scholars are being moved into administration and do not get the opportunity to publish and make a name for themselves. So navigating the academy, my advice would be to treat your career like a small business, that you must find yourself a mentor, and also treat your time as money. Time is very important, only because it just gets, whittled away doing all types of other activities, and we really need to treat it as precious. Try to stay off committees. Also, working towards tenure, what I would suggest is cannibalize your dissertation, publish as much as you can, and try to establish yourself as an expert in a particular area. Do your presentations at conferences, and realize, and for me as well, we know that we might not get support from people who are from our own racial backgrounds, and in this case you have to be part of a group, but you can also work on your own as well. And to win grants, partner with senior scholars, apply for new scholar grants, use any vetting opportunities that your research department might have at your university. And with this, I use this as an example that we as BIPOC scholars, we have a specific an innovative perspective that we bring to the academy that is not there without us. So we have to be sure that we let people know what we do, and that this is our world too, and that we have a lot to offer the academy. So that is it for my presentation. So I'm going to stop the share now.
Thank you so much. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Xiaobei Chen to share some of her thoughts.
Thank you, Kristin. I want to take this chance to thank the organizers for inviting me. I really appreciate this initiative and appreciate how thoughtful you have conceptualized and organized the panel. But I also want to echo what Cora just said. Cora, thank you so much for your brilliant presentation. I want to echo what you said on your last slide, that we ought to firmly believe that we are bringing really, really precious, valuable perspectives, experiences to the academia. Without us, it's going to be a very boring and a very limited place. So let's just firmly believe in that. I think that should be the place where we ground ourselves. I think the focus today is successfully navigating the path towards tenure and promotion. As I was reflecting on my experiences, I feel navigating this path is also to discuss how to be well and how to stay well as a BIPOC faculty member. Because unless we stay well, I mean both physically and mentally and socially, it's going to be tough. It's going to be very tough to go through that path. So as I reflect on my experience, that would be I think the goal, how to be well. I want to use my time to share some thoughts about challenges that we face, and then about how we may approach this. And in terms of challenges, I want to talk about two sets. One are structural constraints. I think we are all familiar with the white-centeredness of academia, which is we run into that every day, right? In curriculum, in cultural norms, in prejudices against the non-white scholars, non-white teachers in classroom. We run into that in almost every class. We run into that in teaching evaluations as well. And we also see structural constraints in the underrepresentation of BIPOC faculty. And also in the student body. While the student body is increasingly diverse, BIPOC students continue to experience isolation and marginalization. So these are the structural issues that then translate into dilemmas and the difficulties that often is seen by people who are not BIPOC as our problems. But actually, these are the problems of the system, of the structures that get translated into these difficulties. For example, demands on service. I mean, that's a direct result of both the issue that we have on campus, as well as the limited number of BIPOC faculty around, and the extra time and extra caring labor for BIPOC students who need our help. So another example would be teaching. Now, teaching load may look the same on paper, but we have more work to do, right? We have to battle with some students' prejudice and the lack of confidence in us. And we have to, we also ought to help BIPOC students who, because we live in society with many forms of racialized inequalities, they have more challenges in their lives and in the health. And we have that too. So these are then teaching. In my institution, the standard load is 2 and 2 in each term. On paper, they are the same, but actually the work is not, right? I think BIPOC faculties work a lot more as a result of this reality. And there are also too many demands on us. I think it's in that regard, I agree with Cora that we have to be very careful with how to really not to say yes to too many committees. And I think from my personal experience, I also feel that it's important to distinguish committees, for example, at the department level versus committees at the faculty level, university level. Because for tenure and the promotion, it's important for you to actually have some exposure beyond the department, for people outside of the department to know you. So if you, let's say in 1 year, have opportunity to both serve at the department level and faculty level, you may want to consider the faculty level committee a bit more than department level. It's useful to get that visibility outside the department, because when the tenure decision is made at the department level, then faculty level, and then university level, And the other thing is also when choosing committees, it depends on institution. At my institution, Carleton University, and in my department, junior faculties can get chance to sit at the tenure and the promotion committees, and that would be worth doing to have that experience and the knowledge about how these processes look like, and that, you know, how people deliberate, how they assess files and so on. So I think these are all, you know, the actual structural issues that get translated into difficulties for us. I want to say that another structural issue is the lack of appreciation for scholarship on topics that may be considered as not as intellectual, right? For, you know, for decades. I mean, I think it's still the case. Studies in the fields of sociology of race and ethnicity is considered as well, really low status, right? It's not as cool, as theoretical, as intellectual than some other apparently more fancy fields, right? And this is something that is really a disadvantage, and we need to recognize that, and we need to point that out, that this is a problem. And I think for some of us who, or many of us probably come from a background where we are also fluent in a different language. Like I came to Canada 26 years ago. So to me, it's very important for me to be able to publish in both Chinese and English. That for me is an intellectual goal, but that worked against me, right? I think up to when I applied for full professorship, my publications in Chinese was again raised as an issue. So I think I just want to flag that. We can talk about more if people want to, you know, kind of have a better understanding about how to strategize around that. So I think that those are structural reasons, but I also want to mention microaggression is really a problem that we should watch out for as well. It's I think it's because it affects our well-being. It's so small, it's so invisible. It almost makes us feel like if we want to raise a question about a microaggression incident, it seems to be our problem. We are too sensitive, we are too thin-skinned. But actually, it can be so corrosive on our sense of well-being, and that will impact our work. It will impact our performance. Now, microaggressions, there are different ways of categorizing it, but I like the sort of the three categories of micro assault. And which, you know, I'll give an example. I once, I was about to step into a meeting about a difficult issue, and the professor, you know, started by saying that, oh, so I understand the word love does not exist in Chinese language. So, you know, why? You know, I think it's a micro assault because it's intended to keep me off balance, right? To rattle me, and those kind of things. You know, it may feel that it's too little to complain about, but it really affects how we feel about ourselves and about the work environment. Micro insult. Here is another example. It's from my colleague at another institution. He said, he wrote to me, he said, a number of years ago, there was a requirement to be a Canadian citizen to be elected to the university's governing council. A white academic leader at the time remarked to me after election, oh, I didn't know you were a Canadian citizen. Microaggressive behavior is pervasive and subtle, But they let us know, let those of us who look different know that we don't belong. So, and then there's micro-invalidation. There's lots of that, right? We experience that constantly in meetings. Again, one example would be that I think BIPOC faculty said something, made the same point, but then it it doesn't appear in minutes, or it doesn't appear to be noted. But then a white colleague said the same thing, and everybody says, "Oh, that's such a great idea!" Right? I think that has happened many times to all of us. So those micro invalidation affects our sense of well-being. So we need to really, I think, consider those as part of the difficulties going forward in tenure and the promotion process. So in terms of how to approach this, I think solidarity is very important. As Cora said, find a mentor, and I would add, find as many allies as you can, and go beyond one's familiar surroundings. And to be interested in other people's experiences as well, and find out multiple ways to flag these concerns collectively, whether through faculty associations or through university level BIPOC caucuses, and so on. I think in the end, we ought to change these structural issues and address microaggressions. I think when we do that, it will make our tenure and promotion process much easier. So I think my time is probably up. I will stop there, but I look forward to the discussions.
Thank you so much. Dr. Dua, could you share some of your thoughts?
Yes, excuse me. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me and for, this really, I think, extremely important and useful forum, and how thoughtfully it's been put together. The questions that we got before were really useful for me to think about my presentation. And I also like to thank my co-presenters for the opportunity to learn from them. So thank you, everyone. So I'm going to start, and I think it's, I'm going to build on in unanticipated ways on what the two people who spoke before me said. But I'm going to start with my experiences. I was actually hired back about 25 years ago. It really is aging me. And when I was hired in my university, I was one of 3 faculty of color, and there were no Indigenous faculty. And when I was hired, just the similar to what Xiaobei has described, I had very similar experiences of racism and sexism, experiencing hostility. I remember for the first 6 months, I would say hello to my colleagues and they would not say hello back. And was in a university that really was really structured by whiteness, in part because there were so few BIPOC faculty, but also in part because of the way it had developed its own identity. One of the interesting things for me, which actually ended up being a strength, was that I didn't really have an effective mentor. I was assigned a mentor who was a very, very well-meaning white woman, but the way that she could negotiate the university and the way I could was radically different. So remember, one of her advices, and remember this is way before email, was that if I got notices of meetings, I should put it in a drawer and not look at it for 3 months. And if no one mentions it, I don't need that information, I can throw it away. Now, that really talks about white privilege. I mean, she was able to navigate the university by ignoring what the demands for meetings were. But for someone who's BIPOC, to do that would be an indication of a lack of competence. So, for me, what came out of, and then one other example was when I, started my work, it was on anti-racist feminism. And this was about, again, 25, 30 years ago. And my department was very unsupportive of this. When I was first hired, I was working on a collection called Scratching the Surface, which has now become one of the classics in feminist theory. And I was told that that would not be necessarily something that would count for my tenure. I got a shirt grant on race, gender, and nationalism. And again, they weren't sure why that was important. And I was told by the chair of my department that I should, think about more valid and respectable areas of research. And so, out of that experience, and then, as others have talked about, I was very quickly put on committees, especially equity committees. I was asked to do extra service. And the service that was invisible, where students, BIPOC students, came to talk to me about their experiences of racism and the responsibility of helping them negotiate an institution that I also was marginalized in. Now, out of this came some takeaways that have actually shaped my life. The first, as others have said, as Cora said, to be true to myself, to be true to the research that I want to do, and to have confidence in that, and to know that I'm going to be able to, that's why I'm here. And in the end of the day, it will, and I don't want to say this because I know people feel precarious, but it will work out. The other takeaway for me was to develop my own support group. And it's something that Xiaobei mentioned, and I think is really important. For my support group, when I first started, was other people who I'd been graduate students with who were employed across Canada, and we would communicate and share experiences. And then as more BIPOC people came into my university, to develop a support group with them. And they remain my support group. We are able to share our experiences and to mentor each other in a way that I found I was not able to get access through more formal mechanisms. The other takeaway for me, and that's been part of my trajectory, was to do research on this. So when I experienced racism in the classroom, Benita Lawrence and I organized a panel where we discussed this and documented it, called Whose Canada Is It? And it led me into a path since then of really doing research and recording inequities in universities. The most recent is the equity myth, in hopes that these would help junior faculty to be able to document that what their experience is as a systemic and structural pattern. The last takeaway was something very particular, and that's what I want to focus on for the rest of my time. And that is, I was fortunate that at the university that I was hired at, they had an equity clause. And that equity clause said that, for race, gender, I think it was mainly race and gender at that time, that faculty who were racialized or gendered, when they go up for tenure promotion, their research should be, the research service and teaching should be evaluated according to the criteria in which they work. So I was in the sociology department, and what that really meant was that equity clause says that my research should be evaluated by those who work in anti-racism and critical race theory, but the same for my service and the same for my teaching. And that was really influential in my navigating my tenure promotion process. While there was a chilly climate, I had seen this clause and knew that this would be a way that I would be able to negotiate tenure and promotion. One of my colleagues, a year before I was going up for tenure and promotion, getting my file together, asked me what I thought. And I said, well, these are the steps that are going to happen. This is where I'm going to face some gaps, but this is what eventually is going to happen because of that clause. That, eventually my department didn't support the kind of research I was doing, that I had this clause that would protect me. And so the takeaway for me was really the importance of institutional measures as well as personal measures. And I want to share that because I think when I was in that situation, I was fortunate to have institutional measures. And, I've since done work to encourage all universities to develop similar institutional measures. And here, one of the important takeaways was really, it's the employer's responsibility to ensure that we are not discriminated against. And we tend to forget that, and we tend to see that as our own personal responsibility. And it becomes on our shoulders. We have to navigate these very difficult, and what Xiaobei and Cora talks about, structural inequities. But I think, we need a larger culture of not those who are going up for tenure or promotion, but more senior faculty to really ensure that we have protections, that the employer does take responsibility. And I'm going to mention, I think, 5 measures, perhaps more. My numbering is always bad. My students will tell you that. First is an equity clause that makes sure that people's research, teaching, and service is evaluated according to equity categories, but not just teaching, research, and service, opportunities. We have all seen people being tapped for a faculty committee who are white, but we don't often see, those opportunities don't always take place for BIPOC faculty. And so what we really need to do is also have, what were the opportunities, and evaluate people by the opportunities that are there. I'll give teaching as an example. Often BIPOC faculty are asked to teach required courses and introductory courses, which are more onerous than courses in their own field. Again, this is a way in which, inequities work. So having an equity clause also needs to look at what were the possibilities and what were not possibilities. The second measure that we need to look at for tenure promotion is a question of course evaluations. A number of universities in the US and now in Canada, Ryerson being the first in Canada, has questioned the use of course evaluations for tenure and promotion. Research at Ryerson, they had a grievance on this matter and did research in conjunction with that, but research elsewhere shows that racialized and especially BIPOC women are more harshly evaluated by students. And so whether course evaluations are an effective measure of teaching is a really critical question. And when they're used for promotion or salary, I think we really need to question that. The other measure, I think, is really thinking about the extra service and mentoring work that BIPOC faculty do. It's a difficult one. I know I tend to say yes to everything. I mean, this year I've said yes to everything, and I'm doing 14-hour days. But as Cora pointed out, and Xiaobei, our labors and insights are also needed in various committees. And one structural way of addressing that is to give course releases and acknowledge the extra labor. So at York, we're talking about having a half course release for BIPOC faculty who are doing intense mentoring and service work. So again, these are structural ways that we can address this. There are 2 more that I want to mention. Right now at York, we're developing, we're looking at the way COVID has impacted racialized and cis women faculty, and trying to think about things like perhaps an early sabbatical to make up for research time. Again, the question of course releases, changing the tenure clock, providing supports for faculty along, during this period, especially for supports for faculty with young children who are finding it very difficult to do remote work, as well as manage young children, especially during periods of shutdown of schools. So COVID and its impact is another structural thing I think that's really important to look at, and for all of us to make sure that we develop effective measures. And then the last is the hardest one. I don't think universities have effectively done this, but we really need to look at our anti-discrimination clause. This is part of my research in the equity myth, they tend to be ineffective. And we need to look at how they can be more effective, because as I started out, the employer really is also responsible for making sure we have a workplace that is non-discriminatory. So, while I point out that there are important personal ways of negotiating this, one of my takeaways from my own personal negotiation was the importance of institutional measures. And I want to raise that here in the hope that the CSA can perhaps take on a discussion with senior faculty of developing institutional measures across sociology departments. What does that mean for people who are going up for tenure? I've got 3 or 4 pieces of advice, and then I will end. First, look at your collective agreement and see if there's anything that is useful there. There may be, and it's really important for you to know that and know how that will fit in, because if anything does go wrong, and 99.9% of cases it doesn't, but if it does, that is where, that is what would be used for grievance. So make sure that you're aware of it. Contact your union and let them know if you're experiencing any form of microaggression or other forms of discrimination. I know faculty associations aren't always helpful, but having that email trail is really useful. Keep a record of all of your emails and correspondence. I'm horrible at doing this, and that's my one advice, because again, you want to make sure that you can document anything that might be needed to document. But I end with, what does that mean? From my experience is, be confident in yourself. Trust the work that you want to do. You're here because we need that work. The climate of the university makes us feel that we're not welcomed and that work is not valued, but that's why we're here. And to remember to have that confidence, because that is the most important thing, ultimately, that you're able to do the work that you would like to do. Thank you very much.
Our last panelist today is Dr. Irene Shankar.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chen, Dr. Voyageur, Dr. Dur, and Kristin for moderating, because a lot of what I've had to say you've already said, but I'm happy to repeat it like a parrot that I am. So I'm a medical sociologist, and I have tenure at a undergraduate university in Western Canada. So a lot of my experiences are probably very specific to my institution. Therefore, I don't know if I feel comfortable saying I have advice, but I have some lessons that I've learned from my experience. And so I'm going to talk about those two somewhat major lessons that I can share publicly. And then finally, the third thing I want to talk about is some strategies that have been effective for me in navigating a university that is predominantly white. So the first lesson that I've learned is that I trusted other people to interpret documents for me. And in my initial writing of this thing, I had know your docs, maybe, like, it's an old song, never mind. So the title is Know Your Bylaws, Policies, and Collective Agreement, because I wish I had read it carefully. I wish I had read the collective agreement before I accepted the position. So that's something I wish someone would have pulled me aside and said, Irene, read it. This is important for you. And it's important in a lot of ways. One of them is, if you don't read it, someone else is interpreting it for you. And as a sociologist, documents are open for interpretation, right? They can be read in whatever way suits people's interest. But I naively thought that policies are policies. It can only be read one particular way. And it took me a while to figure out that that's not the case. So an example would be salary grid. The universities are very clear. We don't negotiate. This is the grid based upon your experience. This is where we're going to put you. But in since I've realized that someone else is making the case reading your CV where you fit, right? And no one tells, so everyone tells you negotiate your salary, right? Which seems like a really good advice. I was told that. And then when I tried, my university's like, no, we don't negotiate. We place you based on your CV. So I'm like, okay, fair enough. It seems like it's a transparent and a logical process. But how do they interpret your skills? It took me a while to figure out after I've been here and other people started getting placed higher than me. And there were all white people who got placed higher than me. Then I realized that it's how people are reading my CV. And if I had taken the time to read the collective agreement, if I knew how experience was being translated, I could have made a case for myself, right? So I didn't know that, and in hindsight, I wish I had known so that I could have made a case for myself for that. And this idea of knowing the documents extends beyond just your collective agreement and the salary grid. In the collective agreement, there's tenure and promotion processes, the timelines, it's the protection that the university offers you that they actually owe to you, and things that you can rely upon. It's been negotiated rights. So all of those things are really useful to know, including things like Robert's rules, which I hate. I hate it so much. I can't tell you the deep hatred I have for Robert's rules, but yet I read it because I feel like without it, I get silenced in meetings. So if I know which motion's out of order, if I know how to contravene when people are saying and doing racist things, it's a tool that I have. So I feel like policies, bylaws, and collective agreement, I wish I had known that sooner and I had learned it to be able to do that. The second lesson that I learned is don't write letters to president. And it seems funny because I came to this position directly. I hadn't finished my doctorate when I got hired. So this was my first position. I came here very eager and I thought, hey, if I just tell and explain to people what's wrong, what kind of racism is happening, what the structural barriers are, what the discriminatory policies are, they'll just take care of it. They'll change it. They'll do something about it, right? So I spent a lot of time writing petitions, writing letters, getting people together to do things. And it's equity work, right? And it's the equity diversity work that gets piled on. And the work of transforming institution often falls on the shoulders of people who are impacted by the conditions. We already know this. This creates the double burden of not only being affected by the issue, but also being tasked to undertake that issue. And even when you point it out to the president, they're like, great, we're having an advisory committee, you're on it, can you do this, right? And the advisory committee has no funding, no charter, no means to implement anything, but go do something. It's kind of like a make work project that they send you off on. So I would say, and we do all of this work while mentoring our students to make sure they're surviving and they're doing well as well, right? So it's a lot to take on. And I wish someone would have pulled aside and told me what Jennifer Nash talks about in her book, Black Feminism Revisited, is that a lot of Black feminists have tried to transform the institution, sometimes at the detrimental cost to themselves. So while we're busy transforming this institution by doing all this work, the same institution will refuse to acknowledge that labor as worthy of attention and promotion and tenure. So it's if I could go back in time, I would abandon that transformation work and focus on my own research and publication. That's what I wish someone would have told me to do, and I could have done that. And I know that sounds cold, and which is why I'm not offering it as advice, but rather lessons that I've learned, that this work comes with incredible cost of erasure, infantilization, saying, oh, you're doing that, are you? That's not important scholarly work, right? This is what we should be doing. And my own career and trajectory and promotion gets jeopardized in this. So which I wish I had known, and I wish I hadn't done that. So the cost is too much, and it's borne disproportionately by racialized and Indigenous faculty members, and it cannot be used to, and all it does is make this university look good at your detriment. So if I had to redo it, I would not do that anymore. So no writing to presidents. So what has worked for me and what has worked for me since the very first time I read Patricia Montour's chapter in this particular book. And so there are a couple books that are like my survival strategies. This is the other one, which is authored by Enaskshi as well. So things, because they are people who've gone through this process before you and they've written about it. So using their language, their strategies has been really helpful to me. So since I read Patricia Montour's chapter on survival strategies, and she talks about how universities are a hostile space for Indigenous students and Indigenous faculty members, and therefore you have to learn how you're going to have to have a plan of how you're going to survive. So this is the things that I've done. One of the first things I do, and it's been so effective so far for me, and I realized, I'm not saying that it will be effective for everyone, but it is for me, that I grew up watching my dad ask for things. He'll just ask. He's like, well, can I do that? And people will be like, it's not standard, but okay, right? So since I've come here, I always ask. I ask for everything. I've asked for, can I teach at this time slot and not this time slot? Can I teach this class? I don't want to teach this other class. Or I wouldn't say I don't want to teach other class. I'd be like, well, I think I'm really qualified to teach this class. Can I do this? I think I would do a great job on it. I think it's students are interested in it, right? And most of the times people will be like, well, no one's ever asked. And that's not how we usually do things, but okay. And so just by asking, there's 50% chance of me getting something concession that makes my workload easier and my life easier. So I do ask, and this is something that I ask. I am trying to teach my child as well. I'm like, just ask. All they can say is no. And once I find, so I feel like I spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to navigate bureaucracy and navigate things that are not in my best interest. And once I find out, this has been my survival strategies, that I turn around and tell everyone else that I'm close to, everyone I know, hey, look, you can do it this way. You don't want to teach at that time, so I just ask. I did, and this worked for me. So by sharing, it does two things. First of all, you're making sure the resource, you're not hoarding resources, you're sharing it with everyone that you find. And the second thing is that when people ask for it, it creates a new normal, right? And now we have a different way of doing things that we didn't do before, which is actually in everyone's interest, and will be an interest for future generations who are coming in. So I like that, and it's something that I believe in a lot. I said earlier, the work of transformation is taxing and depletes a lot. Yes, that's true. But I also know myself. I get angry about things, and I have to fight for certain things, right? So I haven't given up on everything, but I just pick my fight. Like I pick carefully on what I want to do and how I want to do it, right? And not all of them are about transforming the university. Some of them are outside the university. Some of them are just holding university accountable, knowing nothing will change, but I have to say it. So I think I constantly work on what is it that I need to do for my survival, right? So it's no longer about transforming the institution per se, but rather, do I need to do this so that I can live with myself and go on the next day? So that's how I pick my battles. And then all the things that I do, I always list that as service, and I insist that they get counted as service. So even if they're outside the normal committee structure, I put it in my annual report all the time, and then I wait for them to dispute it. And they never do. So it gets counted as service for all the things that I do. The fourth thing I would say has been a good survival strategy, and is developing a community, which all of you have talked about. And it's hard to do, right? Like, I think I heard this advice, create a community, have a community, but it's really hard to do in a hostile environment, because the university and other institutions have been really good at pitting us against each other. So it's that scarcity model. There's only so much, right? And just because someone looks like me also doesn't mean that they're going to have the same interests as me or same politics as me and are interested in the same things that they're interested in, that I'm interested in. So I think it takes a lot of work. So I've always heard this advice of creating community, but I think what wasn't clear to me, what is the work involved in creating the community, right? And it is work. So instead of giving to the university, I want to give to my community, which means that no matter how tired I am, no matter how exhausted I am, I have to show up for my people, and they in turn show up for me, right? And I think all our socialization as academics have been to prioritize research and our own work and not prioritize other human beings. So I think in this, creating a community requires a little bit of realigning our interests and prioritizing human beings that are in the same fight as us, and making sure that we show up for them. And I don't always succeed at that, but it's something that I know it's my priority. So I have to, every couple of weeks, I have to go, am I doing this? I'm realigning constantly, right? Constantly failing, constantly realigning. The fifth thing, I think, which has been really essential for my well-being, is moving away from a Eurocentric and colonial knowledge base. So sociology is very white, including our theorists, our methodology, our like all the things what Sarah Ahmed calls citational privilege. Who gets cited, who gets known and upheld as the scholars and the forefathers, always the fathers, right? So what happens with that is that I walk into the classroom and I'm erased as a scholar, because I can't even see myself reflected. My students don't see themselves reflected in the curriculum. So I spent a lot of time designing my classes with the principles of universal design, decolonizing it, centering anti-racism. And there's two effects of it. First, it feels better to be there, because now I'm part of the content and people like me are part of the content. And the second, and not just as something to be studied, but rather as the knowledge holders, right? As the scholars, experts. So I teach feminist theory course, and everyone in that in the syllabus is listed as everyone in the syllabus are women of color or women, right? Scholars or non-binary scholars, and that is an intentional move, which my students love. I love. It makes me feel better. It makes me feel seen. My students seen, and I'm also retrenching the role that us racialized women have in academia every time I teach that, right? Like I'm making a claim that this is a space that I belong in every time I teach those scholars. So that has been really essential and made me feel less invisible when I'm teaching that. The number 6 is that what Dr. Dua was talking about is that erasure or people telling you what is important, or Dr. Chen was talking about this as well. Dr. Voyageur was talking about it. Like, this is not sociology, this is sociology, this is what's important, this is what scholarship looks like. And you can do that. I mean, do whatever you need to do to survive, right? That's fine. But I think what I found is that I fought hard for what I believe in, because research ultimately comes to a point where you're tired and it hits bumps. And if you're passionate about the topic, you will continue when the bumps come, when the funding runs out, or when the students, research assistants are not working out, or the data collection has hit some kind of barrier, right? So you need to be passionate about it. So I fought for making sure that I research whatever topic I like and get funding for that. So it keeps me going, and that means that it keeps my research going. Number 7, and this is, I haven't really been good at it. I'm trying to get better at it especially in the last year or so. That academic freedom is not just for racists, right? It's for us too. And often it's been politicized and taken up by people who want to say horrible things. So I think it's important that we use our academic freedom as scholars to critique the institution, the governing structure. And this is one of the few tools that we have available to us. So it's important to use it. And it helps with our erasure, right, as academics, so to be able to speak as well. And the final strategy, which again, I'm a bit late to, is that focusing on my research and my publication, because it gives me mobility and academic currency, and it's important so that we're not stuck in places that might be hostile or abusive to us. So those are my strategies. They may not work for everyone, but these are what has worked for me, and there's others, of course, as well. And I'm happy to speak about those as we go on. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions as we go. I think I have to start off a question. Is that right, Dr. Lozanski?
Yes, please.
Okay, so one of the questions that I had is, as a woman of color, I find it hard. We've been talking about community, but I find it hard to do all this work, set up a community, and then because the environment is hostile, that your people you've set up a community with leave, right? Like at Mount Royal, where I am, in the last 6 months, there have been 5 faculty of color and Indigenous faculty members who have handed in the resignation to go elsewhere. So it's just really hard. You work on creating community, and then there is no community because people leave, have to leave for their survival. So what has been useful in your experiences dealing with the hostility and sexism and anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, just on your campus, like what has been helpful for you in terms of dealing with that systematic discrimination at your university in your career? And you've all talked about a few of those things, right? But like in terms of survival, how do you, it's relentless, it's always coming. It's not like it ever says, oh, we're going to take a 2-year sabbatical from this. So how do you survive that and have a career and thrive? Dr. Dewar?
So why don't I start? I think everybody's experience here is really important. It's a crucial question of how do we survive? Before I answer how I survive, I want to say that you really posed, I think, what is the crux of this for all of us. And that is we all have to figure out what is our own survival strategies. And they can vary. I mean, what works for me may not work for you, Irene, may not work for Cora, partly because we're racialized in different ways and gendered in different ways. But also, kind of what is our priority. So I think, I urge everyone to think about what do they need to do to survive. For me, I came to a critical point in my career. I left my first university to go to York, thinking that things would change. And when they weren't, I had to think, what am I going to do? It's not just moving on. It's not, this is endemic in all universities, and had to come up with personal strategies. For me, the phone has always been there before the internet. So having my connections are across York, and some of my strongest connections are outside of York, but also at York, having like that small group of people that I can go and talk to. The other thing for me for survival strategies, especially, around right now with anti-Black racism and awareness on it, is to, throw myself into the university to institute change. And it takes time, it's hard work, as you point out, it's not acknowledged, it's more pressure on us. But after 4 years, we were able to get a Black hire program in our university. And so, that's my ways, like I kind of, that takeaway that I had early on is if we can change little things in the institution, maybe we can make it easier.
Dr. Chen?
Yes, well, I must say that when I was younger, I was not very good with dealing with it. I think that then was very destructive to myself. But I think at this point in my career, I feel one source of guidance that I have found very useful as some Buddhist thought about how to how to live and how to thrive. I feel like one is to expect that nastiness will happen. You will run into it. So and the other is also to accept that you are going to have very strong emotion reactions to those nasty experience, but don't let that overwhelm you. Either the other people's actions or what they said with what they did, or what they thought, and your own emotional reaction. I think to be able to separate your emotional formation and you as a person is really important, to have that distance. So, and also to believe that you are strong, that you are going to get something positive out of this. And there will be, you will be able to turn suffering into both personal and collective growth.
I think Dr. Voyageur has her hand up. Did you want to respond to that as well?
Yes, I do. Actually, a couple of things. One is, expect that things are going to be hard, and, and finding allies outside of, your department, maybe even outside of your faculty, outside of your university. For those of us that were in the game early, I was the only tenure stream professor, Indigenous professor at my university for a number of years. So there was nobody. So that meant that you had to reach out to others. Another thing that was very difficult for me to come to terms with was that, I was not my job. That wasn't my, the only thing that I had, to offer the world and whatnot, and to separate who I was as an individual with what I do for a profession. I mean, that's a hard thing to do. And so that, I had to separate myself, and knowing that, who we are, the types of courses that we teach, the type of topics that we raise in our classes. I teach social stratification and inequality. I teach race relations. So bringing white privilege into the conversation to a class that is primarily Caucasian is a really interesting experience. I think back to the Idle No More movement, and I was asked to speak to seniors on the bow, a group of seniors from Cochrane, which is right beside a reserve, and we know that the relationship between Indigenous people and the townspeople that live right next door to us, although they love our money, and that we keep many of these small communities alive with our purchases and this kind of thing, the relationship is not that great. And this is the same as Cochrane. So when I was doing a number of teach-ins for the Idle No More movement, letting people know what the issue was in the Indigenous community, and how this was, a Canadian and a society and a human situation. So I was speaking to about 200 white ranchers, and honestly, you haven't lived until you've spoken to 200 old white ranchers who live next door to an Indian reserve. So anyway, it was, it was a rough ride. And, at the end of it all, like, I spoke for about 2.5 hours, and to still have people come up to me and ask, well, what about this? Well, what about that? And one fellow who was this big hulking man, I said, he was, standing over me and pointing in my face. And I had to claim that space and say to them, you know what? Back off and get your finger out of my face. And for him to have an Indigenous woman tell him, that what he was doing wasn't kosher, was, I'm sure, probably the first time that had ever happened to him. But it really, people do not want to know the history. People do, in my class, I talk about the Kamagata Maru. People do not know about it. They don't want to hear it. I talk about the head tax. I talk about all of these other things, and it's making people uncomfortable. And that means that, the evaluations that we get and whatnot, our evaluations are going to be lower because we're talking about things that make people uncomfortable. But the thing is that this is our world too. Calgary has been called the Reform School. It's the cradle of the Reform Party in Canada. And I would ride up and down in the elevator with the likes of, you know, Tom Flanagan, Reiner Knopf, Barry Cooper, you know, these individuals that had really harsh opinions about Indigenous people. And, you know, when I rode up and down the elevator with Tom Flanagan, he was the one that looked at the floor, not me. You know, so just claiming that space and knowing that it's going to be hard, but you know what, it's a whole big world out there. And, you know, they've held dominion over us for a long, long time, and resistance and change, you know, is not easy for, you know, for a lot of people, and especially when you've got something to lose. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you all. I just wanted to pick up on a point that you all just mentioned in your responses to that question, and it ties into a question we've received in the chat, which is about teaching evaluations. So if we're thinking about the comments today in the context of junior scholars, or, you know, people who are working through their PhD and who are looking to either secure employment or to get tenure, I'm wondering if you have any specific strategies for navigating, I mean, as you just said, Dr. Voyageur, how uncomfortable students are in the classroom through both your content and your presence in the classroom. Dr. Shankar, you pointed to this when you talked about what it means to be a woman of color in a sociology department. So I'm wondering if you have any ideas for emerging and new faculty members about how to navigate teaching and to demonstrate effective teaching or teaching proficiency, or whatever the bar is for a given tenure file.
I was worried you were going to ask that question because you and I have had we've had a lot of conversations about this. So when we were talking about the hacks and figuring out how to work bureaucracy, I think SEIs are not objective evaluation of our teaching or our expertise in any way. And there's a lot of work that Black feminists and racialized feminists in the US and in Canada who have already done the work of dismantling SEIs. And so when I went in, every time it came in, I would just take chunks out of that work and, like, in the response say, this is why it's not valid, this is why I'm doing this, right? By the end, my chairs refused to look at any of the evaluations, and they're like, none of this is valid. While we were doing this, we were also pushing our institution to question and there were a lot of colleagues pushing on Mont-Royal, and they set up a committee to look at evaluations and the role it should play, and trained people on tenure and committee on how they should be reading these evaluations. Not saying that the misinterpretations and punitive readings didn't happen, but there was a lot of pushback, and it was started by a lot of different groups, right? And mainly, one of the reasons why it was successful is because it's a gendered issue, right, as well. So there were a lot of women who wouldn't normally show up to fight for racialized issue were showing up for this and fighting for this, which Melinda Smith talks about, right? The disappearance of others. So in this particular case, it was a shared interest. Everyone showed up, everyone pushed, so it actually helped. But personally, I found what I do is that I educate my students on how SEIs are used. From the very get-go in the class, I start talking about their interpretation of me, my expertise. I have this I have a set slide. I talk about all my qualifications at the very go, which I shouldn't have to do, but I do. I do, and I make sure that they know how much I know, and then I make sure they know how SEIs are used, right? And I include. I think Dr. Dewar, you and Bonita Lawrence wrote a article about this. So I include that in the very beginning before SEIs are implemented. So I do all of those like little things so that they know what's at stake and how it's used. And still things happen where comments show up. And if the comment is detrimental to me, like for instance, someone said, Irene looks angry all the time. I was talking about genocide in that particular class. So yes, I was a little bit sad, right? Or like my feminist theory class, we talk about a lot of inequality. So it's not exactly happy topic. And also I'm not a very smiley person. So I insisted that they take that out of my SEIs, and I would fight it all the way through. At some point, people do get tired of you fighting, and they do remove it, or at least in my institution they did. So I feel like there was a lot, that was my resistance, right? I fight. It's cost a lot. It's exhausting to fight constantly. But I refuse to have that. I refuse to have that in my evaluation, but it comes up all the time. It comes up all the time. Or if I don't wear my makeup, right? Then they're like, oh, it looks like she's exhausted. I'm like, no, that's just my face. Or like if I don't straighten my hair, she looks unprepared. Like there's so many things. And so now I just explained it to my class at the very beginning. Listen, these are not evaluation. This is not criteria. So that's some of my strategies. It's not effective all the time, but that's just some of the things I do.
So we've just had to say goodbye to Dr. Chen. We're running a bit over time and she had another appointment she had to leave for. But I'm wondering either Dr. Dua or Dr. Voyageur if you have any suggestions for navigating teaching in particular.
With regards to teaching, it's really, the thing that I find is that, and now that I'm older, it's a little bit, age has kind of given me a little bit more authority, but, at the university, we work in a hierarchy, and the students have to recognize that we are not equals. And the fact that, as the professor that, I have, the role and also the duty to evaluate what they do. That's my role. And it was, I know it was difficult for me because, in, the Indigenous community, when you're out in the community and whatnot, you are equal, but not in that environment. In the environment that we are in, that we're teaching, this is what we do. And, I would have, Indigenous people say, oh, she thinks she's all that. Well, you know what? At the university, I am all that. When I'm in the classroom, I am all that, and accept that and know it. And that we, really, it's difficult to, to accept that we are in positions of authority, and realize that, white men do not have to put up with this. They don't have to, show, their 60, their 60 publications. They don't have to do that. And, one thing that I also found, and this has kind of always been a real issue for me, and I don't think it's going to be an issue for much longer, only because we have no support staff, that the support staff were always very happy to accept work from the men in our faculty or in our department. And, I would give work to our support staff, and this is our job, their job, to help us, and they would not do it. They would bring it back to me. And I said, look, if you're going to do typing for Rick, you can do typing for me. And just have to, own that space. And sometimes, people think, oh, well, she's being very authoritarian or very bossy and whatnot. But you know what? That's, we have to just call people on things, and it's not a comfortable thing for some of us to do, but that's just the way it is.
So the question to course evaluations, I think there's many, but first also thank you for others for sharing. Like, these are such, such important strategies and experiences. And, Cora, thank you for sharing. And Irene, like, we do get called authoritarian and angry. And what doesn't get recognized is that for us to be heard, we have to talk in different ways than our white male colleagues. And so that one, I think, is a really tough one I find to navigate. Like, I don't know how I, and you've helped me to how I can create an understanding of that, because it is a really tough one to create an understanding of. The question of course evaluations, how do we respond? I think there's two, as senior graduate student, how do they address it? And how do we respond for those who have faculty appointments? I'm so much a liberal when it comes to some of these issues, where I believe in institutional policies. I think in some ways they are the ones that can protect us while we do the harder work of change. I think our faculty associations and CAUT need to take on a campaign with administration around the biases in course evaluations. I don't think we should have to do all that work. I think we should be asking these organizations to do it. There's 20 years of research, if not more, that demonstrates this. There've been a number of legal cases. And so I think, my response is to go to my faculty association and say, we have to do something here. And the CAUT equity and maybe the CSA equity committee. Because it's a way, it's a way of it's a way that the institutions become responsible rather than us all the time, to have them take it on. For a new PhD student, I want to tell you my experience of being on hiring committees at 2 universities is that you don't actually have to offer your course evaluations, because most often people who are applying are coming out of TA positions. And so there's not an expectation that you would have to offer them. What you do have to offer is a teaching portfolio and your teaching philosophy. And that is something really to hone. And in that is to talk about equity, the ways in which equity impact your teaching in the complex ways. I'd be a bit cautious of how you navigate that, because you may have a department who doesn't really want someone who's going to come on and raise serious questions. And so to put it right in your teaching philosophy may make members of the hiring committee uncomfortable, but there are ways of also putting this, of saying that you're going to take on these issues. And then once you get hired, then say to your chair, this is where the institution also has to take it on.
Thanks. I think that that's really helpful, both in thinking of a kind of a more structural approach and the roles of others, and not accepting all of the additional service that you've all pointed to, but also some really strategic ideas for people who might actually be writing letters and putting together applications and tenure packages right now. I think we're quite a bit over. There's one more maybe question we could go through as a group, and then we could stop recording if the panelists are all okay to stay on for maybe another 10 minutes. Is that okay with people's timeline? 5 minutes? Okay, well, I guess we've got 5 more minutes. Okay, this is one of the questions you alluded to in your talk, and we've seen it a bit in the chat, is also about publications. And how would you recommend that people prioritize what they publish and where they publish, or how much they publish? Do you strive for one really great journal? Do you spread your work across journals that are, maybe in better conversation with your work, if you're working outside of, the American Review of Sociology or something like that? And how many of those would you recommend?
That's a hard question to answer, mostly because it depends on what institution you're trying to get to, right? Like where you're applying and what is your focus, like where do you want to be in? I'm at an undergraduate university that I think, I mean, I don't think they care if it's a top tier journal or not, right? So I think it depends. I would say that sounded so horrible for my university, but I think it depends. It depends on where you're going and what your focus is, and where you want to be. So I think if you're trying to be hired in the top 5, then probably should be the highest, the top journals field, right? Whatever your field is. And usually having 1 or 2, I would say, is probably good for when you're looking for jobs. But it's hard to do while you're doing your PhD. But what Dr. Voyageur was saying is actually right on. Like, try to use your dissertation as you to get published while you're looking for jobs as well. Or, this is something that people didn't. I wish someone would have told me in my doctorate, is that every time we do a paper, we present a paper, try to get it published, right? And I wish I had followed up on that, because we had to write all this intensive papers that we didn't pursue. So I think yeah. So I don't have anything more than that, because it's such a hard thing to do. It all depends on where you're going, what your focus is, what your interest is, where do you want to be, right? And what your field is telling you. Dr. Voyageur and Dr. Dua, do you have more advice? And Dr. Lozanski, I think you are an expert in this as well.
One thing that I might suggest, and if you have written papers, perhaps approach your supervisor or another person in your department and see about co-authoring to get your name out there, because someone who's more senior is going to have the connections. They're going to know the nuances and this type of thing about getting published. But also, as far as your work goes, it's going to help you develop your work to drill down a little bit deeper. And again, one of the things that I mentioned in my talk was to try to set yourself up as an expert in a particular area that is going to help you. So as far as number goes, or are we looking at top drawer publications? Again, I agree with Dr. Shankar that that's a bit of a hit and miss. I mean, it really depends on the mood in the department, but also kind of the lay of the land as far as sociology goes, because we know that there are some areas that are kind of sexy areas that are more of the appetite of that particular time. But you are going to have to decide on whether to you're going to be working hard anyway. So decide whether it's going to be, 1 or 2 big articles or a bunch of other articles. But, again, you have to decide too who you're writing for. And this is something that we, have a wrestling match with in the Indigenous community. Who do we write for? Do we write for other academics, or do we write for the community? Do we write things that people in the community can pick up our book and be able to read it and to understand it? So again, and many times what we write about in the academic realm is something that the community already knows. I mean, if you look at the work of Chandler in BC, talking about suicide, saying that cultural being rooted in your culture is important and it will help stave off suicide. Everybody knows that in the Indigenous community. So, Chandler has, become a worldwide name as a result of that particular work. So anyway, that's my advice.
So, thank you for Irene and Cora for that advice, because I think that is really valuable. And one of the key things, it really depends on the department you're in and your university, and to be aware of those kind of patterns. But I want to share what for my generation was really influential. And again, I mentioned I had a network of people who were across Canada. And in all of our universities, people reported the story of the white man who got tenure with one publication. And so, you know, partly I raise that to say that, you know, the standards are moving. And they move not just by your institution, your department, but they move by, you know, for BIPOC people. And always to remember that, you know, the standards for you are moving standards. I don't know how, you know, I don't know if I have advice on how to negotiate that. I just know how I internalize that and the pressure it caused me. So, you know, how to avoid that is hard because it is actually outside of our hands. I also know that because I was in a university that had an equity clause, I could say I'm publishing in journals that are relevant for my work. And that was, you know, the kind of structural context that also allowed me to do this. But I want to share that, you know, in all of your institutions, there will be white men who've gotten tenure with one publication. And I know one with a publication was in press, not even published. So.
Sherry, I'm wondering if we could stop recording now and then maybe see if there's a question from the floor. And